With the new year, it's time to release the tutorial video and showcasing how to actually deal a lot of damage in PvP for ESO 2023. There's been a lot of changes recently over the last year, some amazing, some very questionable. And with that being said, moving into 2023, we should expect similar changes that they've done when it comes to ESO PvP, and also a little bit of PvE as well. Some of this stuff will apply, but a majority of what we're going to be talking about is more focused on PvP. So if you're looking for a more general PvE, how to deal more damage, what we will be showcasing in this video will still apply. However, there is going to be some buffs like the Angus buff that I will not go over. However, you can simply apply that into your formulas and will still be relevant to you. With that being said, let's get into the meat and bones. So there are 3 tiers that we'll be going over when it comes down to dealing a lot of damage. There's primary, secondary, tertiary. When it comes down to it, you want to have all these min-maxed out perfectly for what your build is supposed to be. A Stam DK may be using more primary stats than secondary stats, while say a Warden will be using more tertiary stats versus their primary and secondary stats based off of what these are. Now I'll be going into exactly what these stats are exactly, starting off with primary. Primary is where you will find your weapon damage, your crit damage, and your damage done. These will make the most impact on your build immediately. If you're lacking a lot of weapon damage, crit damage, and damage done, you will notice that you really can't burst anybody. And then getting into the second one, or the secondary stats, this is where you will find pen, crit chance, and tertiary stats, which are debuffs. Now, getting into this, it is very important that you look at what tune you are running and min-maxing for what that tune does best. So, for instance, tunes that activate a lot of skills inside their combo, and none of them really do too much damage, but if you combo all of them together, you're capable of bursting. These are the tunes that you can lower the weapon damage, and you can lower, say, potentially the damage done, but you should have higher crit damage and then higher crit chance, with potentially more debuffs or pen depending on how you're using your sets. Versus, say, tunes that are activating 2 to 3 skills for their entire combo, and that's it. Those tunes, you want to stack more of the primary stats. You want to stack higher weapon damage, higher damage done with the crit damage, and then have respectable crit chance with your pen. You don't need as much debuffs simply because of you're stacking so much of the primaries. In fact, you can get away with potentially not ever debuffing the target. However, you will still be applying select debuffs based off of what your tune does. With that being said, how do we stack these traits? How do you stack weapon damage? How do you stack damage done and crit damage? Well, simply, it is coming through your sets. It is coming through your CP, which is your championship points. Particularly your blue, that is where you'll find most, if not all, of your damage done and crit damage CP. And then lastly, you need to then stack your secondaries, which is the crit chance and the pen. Pen is extremely easy, same with crit chance. In fact, most sets that you could run or that is meta currently for PvP, any build video will showcase you a lot of amazing sets. For instance, a couple sets right now that are really good for stacking primary, your primary stats will be Clever Alchemist. It will be Gourmand, Back Alley Gourmand. It will be Order's Wrath. It will be Sea Serpent's Coil. And then any other mythics or 5-piece sets or 2-piece sets that just more or less increases your crit damage done, your damage done, and or your weapon damage, weapon and spell damage. I will, for the rest of this video, just simply say weapon damage as well, just to let you know. But because of the hybridization of ESO PvP, it doesn't particularly matter unless you're stacking, say, a minor brutality or a minor sorcery, which is a percentage for your weapon and spell damage. Unless you're having something like that on your tune, it doesn't really matter. They're basically interchangeable. Just make sure that if you put on for your jewelry, say, 2 pieces of spell damage, you can't then stack weapon damage because you'll be losing out on more damage because of how it's set up. It goes off of the higher of which one. So if you're going to start with spell damage, just have it in spell damage. If it's weapon damage, it's weapon damage. It does not matter whether or not you are a magic attune or a stamina attune. With that being said, getting back into the main focus of the video, that is how you'll be stacking your primary stats and your primary traits. Getting into secondary, it is still coming in through your sets and through your CP that you'll get these bonuses, but there's also really noticeable ones as well to get you what you need is, again, Order's Wrath. That grants you a lot of crit chance while also then granting you damage done with your crits. And then other sets for Pen, particularly Spriggans. It's not as good as now, but in terms of to get you in the mind of it, it will grant you 3,000 offensive Pen. More better sets for Pen will be Stoons, and it will be tied to more strength. Another set that is really popular and really in the meta currently, Balorgs, that grants you up to a maximum of 11,500 Pen based off of how much ultimate you have consumed when you activated it. Meaning if you use 500 ultimate, you will get the maximum of 11,000, while also getting 500 ultimate. This is really great for attunes that activate higher ultimates, because then they'll get access to more pen and more weapon damage, which is very crucial in PvP. Now, getting into tertiary, which is debuffs. There are sets that apply debuffs. There is not CP that applies debuffs, and there are skills that apply debuffs. Getting into skills, there's also skills that grant you weapon damage and damage done, but for sake of simplicity, just know for time being you will find most of your debuffs within your skills and your sets, and you will find buffs that will grant you crit damage, weapon damage, and damage done through your skills. However, they are very far in between, and majority of the time if you're going to get a buff, it's potentially through one class's passive and or it is weapon damage. Most class skills grant you weapon damage. Hell, most skills in general in the game will just grant you weapon damage, unless it's coming in through a set. For instance, a great set that will grant you a lot of weapon damage, but the skill itself doesn't, will be the Master's Two-Hand Infernal Staff, or Ice Staff, or in general Destruction Staff. When you activate Destruction Clutch, it will grant you 600 weapon damage. That is a clear, obvious one. There's another one as well, which is Blade Cloak. If you get the Black Rose Prison Dual Wield and you activate Blade Cloak, it will then proc Spectral Cloak. Whenever you deal damage, it will grant you 6% damage mitigation and as well as 6% damage done. But typically, sets do not grant you damage done. Not sets. Skills do not typically grant you damage done. There is notable exceptions when it comes down to that, i.e. Concealed Weapon. This is another massive meta. Whenever you're running a blade, there's a reason why majority of blades that you see currently are mag and hybrid, because of Conceal. It grants you 10% increased damage done, which, getting into everything now, you need to stack as much of every stat as possible. Right now I'm going to showcase you how to potentially stack damage done, crit damage, and weapon damage on a blade and on a DK. So first things first, let's go with the primary stats. When it comes down to a blade, the most important things you need to look at first is what is difficult for you to get access to, right? It is easy for a blade to get weapon damage and crit damage. You get 10% from your passive for crit damage as a Night Blade, which outside of Wardens do not receive that, and Wardens have to run Animal Companion skills in order to receive that. So based off of how many Animal Companion skills they can get, which is a maximum of 6 on their bar, they can get a total of 24% increased crit damage, which is more than a blade. However, it is not best to run all the Animal Companion skills on your front bar. Versus a blade, as long as they have an assassination skill slotted on that specific bar, they will get the additional increased damage to their crits. While also, whenever they deal crits, it will grant them minor savagery, which is increased crit chance. So these two things help out your primary stat and also your secondary stat. But staying within primary stat, you also get a lot of weapon damage coming in as a blade. Typically, most blades are vampires because they will go invisible, which is activating through shadowy disguise, By you going invisible, this will make it where your next attack within 3 seconds will always be a critical strike, as long as you do not leave stealth. There is a little caveat with that. If you leave stealth, like say you activate Shouty Disguise and then pop out of stealth immediately and then try to attack somebody, you have a high chance of it not doing the crit. Even though it should, it doesn't do it. Getting back into, again, the actual point of this video, you go into Shouty Disguise. Because you are a vampire, if you have Vampire Stage 2 or higher, it will grant you additional 300 weapon damage for leaving stealth. You then also have skills, which like Rally and Power Extraction, which will grant you a Major Brutality, respectively. Both of them will grant that. And when it comes down to Power Extraction, will also grant you a Minor Courage, which is a baseline of 215 weapon damage. You can then also stack a set like Clever Alchemist, which will then grant you 129 weapon damage, and when you drink a potion, additional rough 100 weapon damage for the next 20 seconds when you drink the potion in combat. Now, that is roughly 800 weapon damage plus the 215 plus the 20%. That right there is a lot of weapon damage. You going invisible, giving you another 300, allows you to stack an insane amount of weapon damage very, very easily on a blade, while then also getting access to the crit damage and the crit chance through your passives. But there's also other passives like your racial passive that also comes into play. Depending on what race you choose, you can get either weapon damage, damage mitigation, or cost reduction, or resistance, and crit damage. You actually get crit damage for being a Khajiit. So in this case, most blades right now, if they want to deal the most damage, will be running a Khajiit. By you running Khajiit on a blade, you already have the 10% that we were speaking of previously when you have the assassination skill slotted. Say in this case you have Merciless Resolve. When you activate Merciless Resolve, this will also, when you get 5 stacks, grant you additional 300 weapon damage. So that will go into your weapon damage pool as well, so that is your primary stats. And as well, by you being Khajiit, and you have that assassination slotted, you're now getting 22% increased crit damage done just for being a Nightblade and a Khajiit. So you're stacking 2 of your major primary stats just with a couple skills on your front or back bar, and you're getting a lot from your set as well. Going into your sets as well, say you was to go and run Sea Serpent. Sea Serpent will grant you Major Berserk and Major Courage. Major Courage grants you 430 weapon damage. So with you having Major Courage and Minor Courage, you now have additional 645 weapon damage being added to your tooltip. Well, not tooltip, to your weapon and spell damage. This is great because this is again only more inflating our weapon damage, and as well, if you have noticed, we still have the Major Brutality, which is a percentage. So the more weapon damage we have, the more that we will gain out of the Major Brutality. So instead of typically most people get like 500 out of their Major Brutality, you could potentially get 1,000 or even up to 2,500 in some cases of just pure weapon damage from the Major Brutality itself. That is a lot. It is amazing how much weapon damage you can get from a Major Brutality. So, with that being said, we're now going into the big boy damage, which is damage done. This is the rarest out of the primary stats, but also recently has become extremely prevalent through the use of Concealed Weapon. Concealed Weapon grants you 10% increased damage done. As well, by you running Sea Serpent, not only do you get the Major Courage, but you're also getting Major Berserk. So now you're getting an additional 10% increased damage done. So, this is where you have to consider math in this point. Damage done goes first, and then you apply your crit damage. So, if my tooltip before I increase my damage done was say 10,000, you will then add in whatever percentage of your damage done, so in this case 20%, you'll add that to the 10,000. So now we're at 12,000 increased damage done. Not increased damage done. 12,000 damage based off of the tooltip that you have provided, right? You will then crit and then deal additional damage. Now, you have a baseline of 50% increase damage done when you crit. So, by you having that baseline, all you're doing when you get more crits is just adding on to that. So, if you have 50 and then you get an additional 22% based off of the passes that we listed previously, you're now sitting at a nice 72% increased crit damage. So, effectively, whenever you crit, you are going to do an additional 72% damage on top of the 20% damage that you already did. That is an insane amount of damage right there alone. However, we're not done stacking all that we need. Let's get into secondary now, because I believe you're beginning to understand the power of the weapon damage, the damage done, and the crit damage. Getting into the secondary, pen and crit chance. When it comes down to pen, all you really need to know when it comes down to resistance and penetration is that it is subtractive, and it is how much resistance you have versus how much pen. Simply put, the maximum amount of resistance you can have is 33,000 before you go over the cap, which is also a soft cap. But again, this is not a video going over resistance and damage mitigation, but it has to be explained when it comes to penetration. So if you have 33,000 pen, right, or let's make it easier when it comes to the math, if you have 30,000 resistance and somebody has 15,000 pen, you cut their resistance in half and they only have 15,000 resistance, which means they only have 25% damage mitigation based off of their armor. More or less, all you're trying to do when it comes to pen is to meet the average that most people have for their resistance and lower it as much as possible. So, if somebody was to say have 25,000 resistance, right, and you have 10,000 pen, you only make it where they have 15,000 resistance. Now, we'll come back to pen, because when we get into debuffs, this will explain a little bit more, and it will actually open your eyes to explain it a lot better. Now, going over to crit chance. Crit chance is what allows you to deal crit damage. If you have 0% crit chance, you can never crit, so you can obviously see the issue when it comes down to the crit damage. However, you don't want to have too much crit chance, because you still need to stack the crit damage and the damage done and the weapon damage. A average that most people have for their builds for crit damage and crit chance is normally about 80 to 90% increased crit damage and about 25 to about 55% increased crit chance. That's typically what people run. You can have more crit chance, but just try to make sure that you're stacking everything else together so that it makes sense for your tune, and that you're not over critting or you have over crit chance, and say for instance you are not spamming a lot of skills, you don't need that much crit chance. But say that you are activating a lot of skills, you could potentially lower your crit damage to say like 75%, increase your weapon damage, or increase something else in some type of tooltip so that you can then just burn through the enemy faster. But that's getting a little bit off topic. That is what crit chance does. Now you understand what it does. Getting into that tertiary, which is debuffs, let's go back to pen and explain that with debuffs as well. So, there are certain debuffs like major breach and minor breach, which lowers the target's physical and spell resistance by 5,948 and 2,974 respectively. You want to add these to your pen effectively. You're going to get roughly 10,000 extra pen if you're applying these debuffs to the enemy. So if you was to have, let's say again, 10,000 pen and the enemy has 25,000 resistance, you're going to initially cut it by 10,000, and now they only have 15,000. And then you apply the debuffs, now they only have 5,000 resistance when they fight you. That makes it where they have effectively no damage mitigation against you, therefore you're going to hit harder with all your other skills. So, again, to quickly go over this and recap everything in the video, you want to stack damage done with weapon and spell damage with the crit damage. These will make up your true damage. If you punch in your numbers correctly with everything that we've been showing in the video, say your true damage is supposed to be 25,000 crit damage when you apply the attack, right? That's your true damage. Once you get into the armor and resistance, right, you have to calculate with the resistance and everything. It's a very annoying topic, to say the least, when it comes down to armor and resistance. But I'm gonna send up a link to a video somewhere on the screen right now, or it'll be in the description, showcasing damage mitigation, crit damage, and everything else that goes along with that, so that you can basically just punch it into this calculation and see what the damage will be afterwards. But for simplification for this video, if your true damage is 25,000 and the resistance cuts it to, before you include your own pen, to say 15,000, all pen is going to do is get your damage back up to true damage. That's all it's going to do. That is the best way to describe it. And when it comes down to your crit chance, you want to make sure you have a decent amount so that you can then crit. But you don't want to have too much crit chance, because if you have too much crit chance, it's normally because you're running a certain set and it is harming your damage done, crit damage, or potentially your survivability. With that being said, going into debuffs, there are debuffs that actually increase the damage taken a target will receive, and it does depend on which one it is. For instance, major and minor vulnerability increase the damage that the target will take by 10% and 5% respectively. The major grants 10, minor grants 5. There is also debuffs like major and minor brittle, which increase the amount of crit damage a target will take by 10% and 20% respectively. So, let's go back to the numbers we were talking about previously. 20% increased damage done with the 22% increased crit damage. If you was apply major and minor vulnerability to your damage done, you will then have 35% when you hit that individual target that is debuffed. While then, if you apply major or minor brittle, you're now increasing your crit damage by another 30%. So you'll be at 52% increased crit damage, while then having 35% increased damage done. So in total, if you was to, again, have a 10,000 tooltip, say for a dizzying swing, you're going to increase that by a 35%, so that means that's additional 3,500 being added to the tooltip, and then you're going to increase the crit damage by, now, because you have a base of 50%, 102% increase crit damage. Now, you still have to calculate the crit resistance, and I'll just let you know right now, in a baseline fight against another person in PvP, they effectively have 20% reduction to the crit damage. So you're going to take out that 20%, or effectively their major brittle, and it's going to be 35% increased crit damage, or effectively 75% increased crit damage that you apply to the target when you hit them. So basically you hit them for a 20k. More or less, that's the moral of the story when you do crits. So with that being said, how would you do this on a particular tune, or how would you min-max it, or what is a number to kind of understand how high you can get everything situated with this tune, right? For a mag blade, there is a combination where you can get up to 108% increased damage done while stacking additional 100 and either 12 or 8, I forget the exact number, crit damage, while then stacking 6.5k weapon damage, having 9k pen. There you go. Oh no, that's 10k pen. Apologies. Hello. While having about 36 to 38% increased crit chance. Now, when it comes down to the debuffs, remember that some of the debuffs you will simply just apply to your major not your major. You'll simply just apply to your primary or secondary stats. Other ones aren't exactly like that. For instance, minor defile or major defile, which just reduces their healing recovery and their healing received. That basically makes it whenever they do get hit, they can't heal up as much. There's other debuffs like that as well. With that being said, that goes over the very complicated list of how to hit hard in ESO. And I more or less gave you example of some stats and some skills that you can use in order to min-max and hit as hard as possible. As you've seen throughout the video, there have been multiple 10Ks, but there have been multiple 20Ks and 20K plus. It is very much doable right now, January 5th to the January 6th, to hit this type of damage. And even if in December of 2024 they make vastly wild changes to all the skills and how everything else is set up in the game, the baseline of what I told you, which is the primary stats, secondary stats, and tertiary stats, these will not change. This is the core of PvP, and this is the core of ESO. All you have to do is stack the right amount of these numbers in these stats, put it on the right skills, and with the right playstyle, and you will always be capable of hitting bare minimum 10k plus in PvP. Hell, there are cases where you can hit a 51k vicious death. How you do it, I want you to go and figure it out yourself. With that being said, I'll holler at y'all later. Peace.